press conference at the Pentagon, saying that he opposes using the military to control protesters. Take a listen.
I say this not only as Secretary of Defense, but also as a former soldier and a former member of the National Guard. The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now. I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
Joining us now from the White House briefing room is our White House correspondent, Emerald Robinson. Emerald, how did the White House react to those comments?
Hi, Sean. Yeah, well, Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany was asked about that statement during the press briefing today, specifically still asked if the president had confidence in his Secretary of Defense after those statements. McEnany said that the moment that the president no longer has confidence in Esper as the Secretary of Defense, the press would be the first to know. However, in regards to the Insurrection Act, she said that Esper had never directly voiced that opinion during meetings here at the White House, while not necessarily getting into the specifics of any conversations that were had between officials about that. However, the press secretary also did double down on the president's threat to use the Insurrection Act if need be, suggesting he absolutely has the power to do so, and said that POTUS could use it and encouraged a strong response to the violence and looting across the nation. Of course, when I asked her about New York and the possibility of sending troops there, she highlighted the differences in the tactics used here in D.C. and New York, and also the fallout of what we have seen in New York in what she says is not taking a tough enough stance.
Wow. Well, appreciate the heads up. We'll see where he stands in the next few days, but thank you for the update.
Yeah.
Beyond all the protests and riots, there was a little action going on over at the Senate today. Former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Rosenstein found himself in the center of FISA abuses, a rogue FBI and Democrats determined to get Trump out of office. Here's what he had to say when asked about the investigation.
Do you consider it to be an utterly baseless, corrupt criminal investigation as you reflect on it today?
I do not consider the investigation to be corrupt, Senator, but I certainly understand, I understand the president's frustration given the outcome, which was, in fact, that there was no evidence of conspiracy between Trump campaign advisors and Russians.
Well, joining us now is a gentleman who has been trying to get to the bottom of all of this and been one of Rod Rosenstein's fiercest critics, Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz. Congressman, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Okay, let me first off just play you a little clip of what Rosenstein had to say when Judiciary Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham asked him about this scope memo, which is what authorized this whole Mueller probe.
Where did the information in the document come from? Did it come from the Mueller team?
I believe it came from the Mueller team, but it came to me through the team that I had set up to interface with the Mueller team.
Was it from Strzok and Page? Are those the people preparing all these documents?
I don't know who was preparing.
Were they in charge?
He doesn't seem to know, Congressman. Does that concern you that this memo that he signed off on that started the entire Mueller probe, he doesn't know where it came from and who started it?
Yeah, Rod Rosenstein seems to be either a useful idiot or a corrupt and complicit actor in all of the predication of the Russia investigation. He wrote the scope memo, which allowed us to be able to go off on this venture that delegitimized the presidency. And similarly, Rod Rosenstein signed the FISA warrants that gave the ability to renew spying on the Trump campaign, and he didn't even admit to having read those.
I also think it's interesting, Congressman, that the response that he gave to Senator Durbin seemed to kind of have it both ways. First, he says that it was a legitimate inquiry. Then he says, well, I'm glad that it proved that Trump did nothing wrong.
Yeah, and then even later in his testimony, he said that he regrets having signed the FISA warrants that allowed the continued spying on Americans. And so, Rod Rosenstein has repeatedly tried to weasel out of accountability, even when he's been caught. I think, Sean, to the time when Rosenstein was busted saying that he wanted to wear a wire on the president, he wanted to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove the president. And then when we asked him about those things, he said, well, I was just kind of joking. And so I think that time and again, Rod Rosenstein Rosenstein has proven to be very complicit in the corrupt origins of this investigation. The scope memo that you mentioned at the beginning of our interview is evidence of that, because we now know that that was predicated on information that our own FBI knew was being targeted by Russian intelligence to try to reduce our confidence in the election where we legitimately selected Donald Trump to serve as our president. I'm glad Senator Graham is having these hearings, though, because it does provide the necessary foundation for the Durham report that's upcoming that I think will create criminal consequences rather than just a wag in the finger in the face of some of these deep state operatives.
Congressman, I want to switch gears just a little bit to one of your recent tweets that Twitter put a warning label on, saying that you are inciting violence. We even had Senator Murphy say that it should be taken down because it incites violence, saying that Antifa should be chased down because they're just like terrorists. Do you think you crossed the line at all by what you said?
No, Antifa are terrorists. Our own government, our own Justice Department, the Attorney General has designated Antifa as a terrorist organization. And in the United States of America, if you can't favor the hunting down of terrorists, it's certainly a tragedy. And so I would suggest that it's entirely appropriate. Now, we don't support vigilantism. In the Middle East, where we're hunting down terrorists, we don't have like individual American citizens roaming around the sand dunes with guns trying to find terrorists. It is a whole of government response. Here's how we ought to hunt down the Antifa terrorists. We ought to freeze their money, we ought to track their movements, and then we ought to stop them by whatever means necessary from harming Americans. My point is that if we can spend trillions of dollars and the blood of our bravest patriots defending the Bedouins and sand dunes of the Middle East, we should provide at least that amount of protection for our own people, for our own businesses. It sure would be nice if Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut cared as much about the Americans who are suffering at the hands of these riots as he does his woke virtue signaling on Twitter.
You know, Congressman, you've been very outspoken about the bias that exists on social media platforms, and I think it's absolutely right. Are you concerned about what they are doing to silence President Trump and his supporters heading into this election?
Of course, in 2016, as you well know, Sean, because you were part of the great winning operation, we caught him by surprise. A lot of folks didn't think Donald Trump could win. Now we've lost that element of surprise, and we see some major technology platforms trying to put their thumb on the scale and reshape the nature of debate in our country. It's one of the reasons I'm working with Senator Josh Hawley on legislation that will alter certain immunities and protections that online platforms like Twitter and Facebook enjoy that allow them to engage in this type of bias without any liability or consequence. The national discussion that we're having around all these issues is too important to allow Silicon Valley to tell us, what the thought police are seeking to enforce that day.
Yeah, I appreciate it. We've been talking about this all week. I appreciate your leadership on this issue, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sean.
You bet. All right, we've got a lot more coming up in the show. We're bringing in our company to break down the latest war of words between the president and Joe Biden. And you heard what Congressman Gaetz just said about censoring conservative voices on social media. Our series, Blocked and Banned, continues. The founder of Prager University, Dennis Prager himself, joins us to tell us about his lawsuit against Google for the very same reason. You are not going to believe why he was banned. You're not going to want to miss this.